You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, he's a repeater. His first book, we talked to him several months ago, maybe late last year, Patton's Payback, a terrific book. And we're recording this on December 19th, 2024. So we're in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge, which Patton did a lot to help turn the Americans' way. But Stephen L. Moore has written not only that book, several others, and the book we are discussing today, Beyond the Call of Duty, The Life of Colonel Robert Howard, America's Most Decorated Green Beret. Mr. Moore, thank you for coming on the Leaders and Legends podcast again. I love your books, and I'm very grateful to your publicist, to everyone, to Hannah, who's helpful to get us connected.
Hey, Robert, it's a pleasure to be back again, and happy to discuss this book with you today.
So there's obviously the American military is certainly not short of heroes, not short of brave men and women, but a few people stand out. When I first started the podcast in 2019, I interviewed Sammy Davis, who received the Medal of Honor in Vietnam. He lives here in Indiana, and he and his wife, he and his Dixie are just spectacular, wonderful people. And I asked him off recording, what you did is so incredible to receive the Medal of Honor. Is there anyone who you can think of who just really impresses you? Bob Howard. Took him 5 seconds.
About that.
Colonel Howard is a legend among legends. Tell us a little bit about his background, which led to his truly unparalleled service, not only in Vietnam, but in the United States Army.
Sure. Bob Howard grew up in rural Alabama, in Opelika, Alabama. Large family, a lot of brothers and sisters, and they were not well-to-do. His father had been a paratrooper in World War II, along with several of Bob's uncles, one of whom was wounded. And that made an impression on him, them being in an elite unit like that. But he grew up just a poor, average school kid, and his Granny Callie helped to raise the kids. His father wasn't the best of role models, wasn't around the house a lot. So with his mom constantly having new kids to deal with, Granny Callie helped teach the kids how to read out of the Bible and instilled in them good morals, service to the country, respect the flag. And he learned a lot from her. One of the early chapters, I talk about one of his incidents where he was being bullied at school. And Bob Howard was always a runner. He was an athlete. He loved to run. And his recourse was to run from those bullies after school to get away from them because they wanted to beat him up and steal his new tennis shoes. And Granny Callie confronted him one day when he came racing up to the house and basically said, "Bob, what are you doing, boy? What are you doing running from this?" You need to turn and face your problems, face them head on. And that became something he learned to live by. And he would follow that instinct through Army much later in life.
It's interesting, as well as any historian writing today, the grassroots, that's more of a political term, but the grunt, what goes through their mind, what they have to do to succeed. But it's also interesting, the tradition of military service within families. I cannot think of any family that I've met that had a one off. It's like it's contagious. I did a count in 4 generations of my family, there are 15 veterans, and it's not surprising. So when Stephen Moore sees this example of service with his father and his uncles, do you think that marked him for, look, this is what I'm going to do? I just got to get old enough to do it.
Yeah, I think he was very interested in the military service, and he saw some of the airborne troopers marching through and on parade and things like that. And he decided one day, I want to be airborne. And when he was barely old enough, he went and enlisted with the Army. Didn't sit well with his father at first, but Bob stuck to his guns and proceeded into his military service. And he was involved in the Army for a number of years and got married during those early years, long before Vietnam came around. So I think he decided that was his calling and that's what he wanted to do.
He joined the service in 1956. So in that Cold War period between the hot wars of Korea and Vietnam, did he join with a sense of, I'm going to be, I'm not going to say I'm going to be in combat, but this sort of lull isn't going to last forever. So I know what I've gotten myself into.
Yeah, I think he knew what he got himself into, and he always wanted to become airborne. And by the late 1950s, he did proceed with that goal. And he was, like I said, he was an athlete. He was very well built. Some said he looked like a young Clint Eastwood back in the day, 170 pounds, 6 feet tall, had that grimace, had that look and that squint about him when he get angry. And he was not a guy to be messed with. But even in basic training and some of the other advanced training, if he had a buddy or somebody that was really struggling, he did the extra mile to help that person get through and to persevere. But Bob didn't find much to be challenged on those physical routines. He excelled in that kind of stuff.
I listened to some of interviews that not only that you and his daughter did in promotion to promote this book, but I listened to some of the interviews that Colonel Howard did, especially the one where he describes the action for which he received the Medal of Honor. He sounds like Shelby Foote.
Yeah.
He sounds like he should be narrating a history of the Battle of Shiloh or Chickamauga. He has that deep Southern accent.
Real Southern accent. Yeah.
It's so good. And it just seems like it fits his personality. Like, throw everything you have at me. It doesn't matter.
Bring it on. Yeah.
As part of his military training, you mentioned that he airborne, Green Beret, special operations. Are these things he had to volunteer to do, or was he plucked based on his ability?
Yeah. Some of it's desire. He said the first time he jumped out of an airplane was when he was jumping out with a parachute. That was the first time he actually went up in an airplane, I should say. But airborne was something he wanted to do since his father and uncle had been paratroopers in World War II. And eventually, yes, he does become a Green Beret, but he's with the 101st Airborne when he officially deploys in 1965 over to Vietnam on his first tour of duty. And there's a story there and how he comes to end up in what we know as Mac V. SOG with the Green Berets.
Please go ahead. I want to hear it.
Yeah, so he gets over there in 1965 and lands there and near Kinan, a little village there. He gets into his first firefight, and Bob's a squad leader, and he's not real impressed with the leadership there and how the guys are organized and going into the fights. And they get into a scrap during the night with some VC forces near an old village. And in the midst of the dark and the fighting, they end up in a cemetery. and all the bullets flying. One hits Bob Howard in the face, goes through his jaw, shatters some of his teeth, and knocks him down into the ground. And with the bullets flying, he's crawling around trying to keep himself low and figure out how bad his head shot up. And he ends up in a grave. And the Vietnamese there would bury their bodies upright with the mounded up dirt. And so he literally ends up face to face against a rotting corpse throughout the night, his head wound and bleeding and bullets flying. And it's not until the next morning they find him and realize that Bob Howard is still alive. So he survived that, his first firefight, and ends up in a military hospital there recovering. And lo and behold, one of the guys there is a sergeant he knew from his training days, this guy, Bob Curtin. And he get to talking about what he did and how they're both wounded. And in comes this 5th Special Forces group, Colonel McKean, checking on his Green Berets, checking on his wounded men. And Howard's laying there thinking, nobody's checking on me. I've been shot in the head. What do you deal with this? These Green Berets seem to take care of each other. And his buddy tells the colonel, hey, this guy, Sergeant Howard here, he would be a heck of a trooper. He would make an excellent Special Forces guy. And so they exchanged some information. And not too long later, Howard's called up to go to Saigon to see the 5th Special Forces Group and to volunteer for Special Forces training and duties there. So he took the chance when it was offered. He saw that they had better organization, better teamwork, better brotherhood, and he just loved that opportunity.
Let's notice here very quickly, you referred to him as Sergeant Howard. He retired as Colonel Howard. That's not a path that many people take. It's obviously more prevalent with battlefield promotions during wartime. How did he go from enlisted to officer?
He ended up doing 4 tours of duty in Vietnam. And so during that time, he received numerous medals from Silver Star to Bronze Star to Air Medal, 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, one of which was upgraded to the Medal of Honor, of course. And during the course of that back and forth between the service and back in the States, he managed to get himself in for officers training and was commissioned a first lieutenant after his 3rd tour. And during his time over in Vietnam, prior to receiving the Medal of Honor, he had fleeted up to captain by that point. So he was Captain Howard by the time he went to the White House in 1971. So he had many years of military service already, but he was one of the ones that qualified to go through officers training school.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is best-selling author, historian Stephen Moore. We are discussing his new book, Beyond the Call of Duty, The Life of Colonel Robert Howard, America's Most Decorated Green Beret. Why are we discussing this book? Because of this man and this author's work. Colonel Howard received the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Defense Superior Service Medal, 4 Legions of Merit, 8 Purple Hearts, 4 Bronze Star medals, and so many other medals that it's really can't even try to go through all of them. I did receive a Meritorious Service Medal for my time in the military. Colonel Howard had 3. He also had 4 Air Medals, and I can take up the rest of the time of the podcast going through everything. Stephen, how did it come to you to how to translate what this man did, the level of courage that he had, not only through his actions, but through just his insides? How hard is it to put that pen to paper and get the reader, someone like me, to go, okay, now I have an understanding of what he did?
Yeah, I think you have to go through some of the missions and see what he did, because it's not slighting what any of these other guys did. They've all gone through advanced training to be able to jump out of planes, to handle various military specialties, from demolition to whatever it might be, communications. But Howard was elite among the elite. I came to know about him many years ago in the family reunions. My wife's uncle, uncle-in-law Wilson, he was a Green Beret in Vietnam. He was a MAC-VSOG team leader, a recon team leader. And we talked about that. And, I kept saying, Wilson, one of these days we need to sit down and go through all your stories. And he shrugged it off like he just did his job. He was just in the Army, no big deal. But when John Plaster's book came out in 1996 on SOG, that's when some of these missions were beginning to become declassified. Our family member Wilson and all these other guys, they really couldn't talk about what they did. It was all covert. It was all classified. And you see his name in this book that Plaster did. And you're like, wow, you didn't just do your job. You were out there doing some pretty elite stuff, capturing prisoners of war and all that. And I decided to write about his story. But in the course of doing that, I started attending some of these military reunions, the Special Forces reunions in Las Vegas. And Wilson would take me there. And I realized it wasn't his story. The recon base he was stationed at, FOB2 Khartoum, Forward Operating Base 2 in Khartoum, they had 5 men, eventually 6 men, that earned the Medal of Honor, and many others that earned the Army's top award, the Distinguished Service Cross. And you're talking about, as far as Army troopers on the base, usually 60 or so at the most. So in that small of a company, to have that many men earn the Medal of Honor was outstanding. But as I attended these reunions and interviewed all these guys, I saw that all these Medal of Honor stories, there's a much bigger picture there. And that led to my book called Uncommon Valor. But all these guys, almost to a T, if you talk about bravery and who was just defied anything thrown against him, Bob Howard's name always came up. Bob Howard was the bravest of the brave. One guy called him a one-man army. And to hear the stories of some of these missions was just incredible. So that got me sparked on eventually deciding maybe Bob Howard deserves his own story.
Bob Howard went to Vietnam in 65. It didn't take long for him to make an impact. Anyone who's either seen the movie We Were Soldiers or read the book understands a little bit what's going on at this time. To your knowledge, did Colonel Howard express any sort of opinion? Why are we here? Or, hey, we got to help these people one way or the other? Or, as you've mentioned several times, this is where my commander has told me to go.
Yeah, he was pretty much doing his job, but he had this overriding sense of wanting to be in the action, wanting to mix it up and get out there. In his first tour, where he eventually gets pulled into the 5th Special Forces Group, he goes out on recon, long-range reconnaissance patrols, and he's in the early stages of his Green Beret training, and he earned his Combat Infantryman badge, which, of course, you only earn through active combat there. But he returned back to the States in 66, and in 67, he would return for his second tour of duty, and by that time, he had become a Green Beret, had completed the training for that. And that's where we get him stepping into MACV SOG, Military Assistance Command Vietnam. And then this group with this innocuous sounding name, the Studies and Observations Group. Kind of low-key kind of name, doesn't raise a lot of eyebrows. But these guys are the best of the best. Primarily Green Berets, a handful of Navy SEALs served on some of the teams. But they generally included 2 or 3 Americans, Green Berets, and then a number of indigenous troops, from local Chinese Nungs to a lot of them using an indigenous group called the Montagnards. The Green Berets shortened their nickname to Yards, but smaller local tribesmen of various tribes, almost like Native Americans would have tribes here. They had slightly different dialects, different cultures within these tribes. But these men wanted to be freedom fighters, so they volunteered their services with the Green Berets. And they were very adept at the jungles, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. They were excellent trackers and huntsmen, and they became quite good with all the military weapons that they were given. But this is what you had, was small groups, 2 or 3 Green Berets, 3 to 6 Montagnards or Nungs going out with them. And they're going on covert missions. Could be to sabotage enemy ammunition, could be to wired communications observations, looking over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, attacking or blowing up trucks on the trail, attempting to grab prisoners of war, or just gathering intelligence for Saigon on what the the NVA is doing in certain regions. But the most interesting thing about the SOG men is it was all voluntary. They went forth and had these briefings with various high-level Army, with CIA, and they were pretty well instructed. And I talked to my uncle and lots of other folks about this. Probably 50% or more of you in this room, you will be killed or captured or badly wounded. So make sure you know what you're volunteering for before we go forward with any more training. And they understood that when they went out on these missions, they had to go in sterile. No dog tags, no Army insignia, no American weapons that could be traced. So if they were killed or captured across the fence, as they say, or in enemy territory, the U.S. government's going to deny that they were there or anything about their existence. So they knew what they were in for as SOG operatives, but these guys volunteered for it. And that's what Bob Howard came into in 1967 on his second tour.
But is there any indication of what he felt about, how he felt about the war, like generally when he kept coming back, sees the protest, reads the newspapers, watches the TV? Did he express any sort of opinion about World War II as quote unquote the good war? Why are we here in Vietnam? But it doesn't matter. Or did he just not even talk about politics at all?
I didn't see much about that. He had that deeply ingrained sense of country, sense of service, honor the flag, and the mission at hand was this war, and he was part of it. And he didn't have to go back time after time, but he continued to re-enlist, continued to go back, because he knew this was going to be a career for him. And the mission at hand was, no matter how bad it was, he was ready to go. And we can talk about that in a minute, of how he went from supply sergeant to what they called strap hanger, which meant you're a volunteer for these missions. You've got a team that's got somebody killed or wounded or maybe with malaria, down sick, and you're tapped to go out on a special mission. A lot of times they need to grab a volunteer from the recon company. And Howard, one of his occupational specialties was supply. He'd been a supply sergeant back at Fort Bragg. So when he arrived at FOB2, the advanced base, they noted that, said, all right, you're going to be in charge of supply here, Howard. And he did that with a great sense of, pride, took care of writing requisitions, doing what's required.
Mm-hmm.
But his heart was mixing it up and getting into the combat. So he would volunteer any chance he could to go with these teams across the fence to get out there and do his duty. But no, I didn't see a lot of notes from him as far as liking or disliking the American opinion of the war. But much later in life, he was very supportive of POW and MIA initiatives and trying to bring home men that were left over there. So he was very dedicated to the objective at hand.
You mentioned a few minutes ago that many, if not all, especially early, of the missions that Colonel Howard undertook were classified, secret, however where you want to say it. That caused, it's interesting to note that Colonel Howard is the only person nominated 3 separate times for the Medal of Honor, 3 separate actions. But the first 2 took place on these sort of surreptitious, clandestine missions. Why did the government feel it necessary to take what were recommendations for the Medal of Honor, and I'm going to say downgrade, but that is clearly not the right word, even though that is the word I think the military uses, to the Distinguished Service Cross and the Silver Star? Speaking of a little bit of politics being involved.
Yeah, it's a long process for most of those guys. If it was quick, it might be 6 months to have the paperwork go through its normal course of red tape to get up to the congressional level. In Howard's case, it was more than 2 years after his mission in December 1968, all of 69, all of 70. It wasn't until early 1971 that his paperwork, finally made it through the channels, and he was called to the White House. The first 2, you can have your recon sergeant or company commander or somebody submit and recommend. And his valor was not questioned, but it just didn't hit the necessary level with the various stages of Army command to approve those. But like I said, his valor was noted going back to 1967 on the first mission. And as we mentioned, those were downgraded, if you will, but he did receive a prestigious award in each case, the Silver Star, or in the second case, the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the highest the Army can offer. But it took more missions and more display of his true courage and bravado before it finally hit a level where they said, okay, I think we've got to pin this medal on this particular man here.
But whereas, is it fair to say, because the Medal of Honor is accompanied by some fanfare, right? You go to the White House most of the time, assuming it's not posthumously. But there was political pressure and geopolitical pressure to downgrade those awards because they couldn't do a White House ceremony and acknowledge the operation for which he received the medal.
True, yeah. And some of his comrades that had received it ahead of him, some, as you noted, were killed in action. Fred Zabatowski, Recon Team Maine, received the medal during Bob's time over there at FOB 2. And when Zab eventually went to the White House, they noted, we know it says on the back for action in Vietnam, but they could not disclose that these missions were in Cambodia or Laos or anything at the time. It was just simply in the interest of national secrecy that they even today, obviously, we have men and women doing things that you and I don't know about and probably won't know for decades. And if the government was asked, they would flatly deny it. But that was part of what they had to do. The guys that served with each other, they knew what they did. They knew what they earned. They know where they were and what they were doing. And even today, they're getting up there in age. They're in their 80s now, most of these guys. A lot of them have passed in the 10 years. I've been talking to some of them. Excuse me, it's unfortunate. My uncle-in-law just passed this past month. That was something just on a sidebar, seeing so many Vietnam-era Green Berets show up and attend the service and sing the Ballad of the Green Beret and present awards and do the various ceremonies. That brotherhood was tight. Those guys, they know what they did. And you sit down and talk to them at the reunions, and they don't open up to just anybody about that. Some do. Sure. Some are a little more reserved. So it took a little earning some of their trust and getting in to hear some of these stories. But yeah, it had to be tough to bite your tongue for decades and not talk about what you did to anybody. But among the brotherhood, they talked widely about who did what and where they were. And at least nowadays, there's a little bit more recognition being offered in the past decade or two.
Absolutely. I mentioned the Distinguished Service Cross and the Silver Star. These are significant awards for courage and bravery. Is it fair to say that they're just overshadowed by the positive notoriety of the Medal of Honor? And what percentage of people in combat, or what percentage of people who serve in the military, receive a Silver Star? It's a fraction of a fraction, let alone a Distinguished Service Cross. Did you get the sense that Colonel Moore was just as proud of his actions in receiving those awards as he was when he received the Medal of Honor?
I'm sure Howard was very proud of those medals, but he wouldn't want to go around and show off or talk a lot of bragging about what he'd done. They did have a party one night at the base for him after he received his DSC, and they made a bunch of hoopla about it, but that was not something he wanted to do. He was just doing his missions, and if you see the pictures of him standing straight at attention, he almost looks awkward as they're pinning him with the medals, that he didn't really care for all that recognition. Even when we get to the White House, I talk about that story a little bit. He almost felt faint at the time. He just was so nervous and awkward. There's another story in the book when he's sent back home after being severely wounded. He's recovering, and he's in North Carolina at the base. And shortly before he's going to deploy again, they call him forth to have an award ceremony. And his wife and his two young daughters show up, and they're there watching, expecting him to get a Purple Heart for being wounded or whatever. And instead, he receives multiple Purple Hearts, Air Medals, Bronze Star, Distinguished Service Cross. He ended up getting 8 awards at that one little ceremony there at North Carolina.
Incredible.
And his wife is certainly what are you doing over there? Because he just didn't talk a lot about that. He didn't say, yeah, I nearly got killed, or I got hit by shrapnel, or I got shot again. He just shrugged it off. That's my job.
He was wounded in combat 14 times. Is that correct?
That's by his count. On a couple of the missions, he's wounded multiple times on different days. So I guess technically those could each classify for a Purple Heart if you get hit by shrapnel and 3 days later you get hit by bullets. They officially processed the paperwork for 8 Purple Hearts, but by Colonel Howard's count, he said he was significantly wounded 14 times. I know some of these Green Berets on the SOG missions would get nicked by a bullet or hit some shrapnel in the leg, and if you didn't bother to process the paperwork, you never received the Purple Heart, or just didn't. You patched yourself in the field and shrugged it off and dealt with it. That's what some of them did. Not all of them were about how many medals you could put on their chests. And some would do missions that were above and beyond, where somebody else, no offense to them, got a Bronze Star or a Silver Star. And these guys would come back with the Army Commendation Medal. One of them, Joe Walker, is probably one of the bravest of the brave. I talk about him in Uncommon Valor. And a couple of missions where officers got higher medals and he got a much lesser medal, and his was shot up and he pulled in prisoners or whatever he did. He went, what are these medals worth anyway? It wasn't about collecting trophies for these guys. It was the mission at hand and being the best that they could be in a lot of cases.
Let's go to, because I loved watching him, Colonel Howard, talk about it, describing what happened. It's December 30th, 1968, which would have been my brother's 8th birthday. I'm guessing Colonel Howard didn't know. Anyway, let's talk about what Colonel Howard did to earn the Medal of Honor. What happened on that day?
So the previous day, Howard is just recently, he's recovering from wounds from a previous mission, a SLAM mission, where he was wounded multiple times. And in the book, I show pictures of him coming back, carrying this prisoner of war that he's taken. That was an extraordinary mission in itself. But he's still recovering from his wounds. He's run another mission in early December where his team leader is shot 4 times, and he helps him escape and get on the chopper and pull him out of the fire zone. But long story short, another team has gone out and been overrun by the NBA. And one of the men, Private Bob Sheridan, is missing. He's a young team member on the recon team. And there's some concern that possibly he's alive. There's a beacon still transmitting, but they don't know if it's an NBA trap. But either case, the SOG teams didn't leave a man behind if they could help it. They would go in and recover a wounded man or retrieve the body. And they called these missions bright light missions. So bright light was to go in and help pull out an overrun team or to recover bodies. And in this case, they didn't know if Sheridan was alive or dead. But the next morning, Howard's part of a platoon-sized group sent in to go retrieve this Green Beret. And he's got dozens of mountain yards, the indigenous troopers, several Green Berets, and a first lieutenant, Jim Jerson. So Jerson's officially in command. Howard's second in command of the Bright Light. And they're put in on December 30th, 1968. And the story itself would take an hour or two to tell, but they were hit pretty quickly by significant enemy forces, firefights. They're battling it out. And Lieutenant Jerson and Howard are in the most forward position with a couple of their point men, the mountain yards, and they come under severe fire, grenades, RPGs, shrapnel flying everywhere. And one of the bursts, one of the explosions blows Bob and the lieutenant 2 different directions. They're both hit pretty severely, shrapnel and puncture wounds everywhere, bullets going off all around them. And when Howard comes to, he realizes the lieutenant's badly hurt, but he also comes to and realizes his fingers are mangled. His car 15 has been shredded and blown apart. It's useless. He's got severe injuries in his ankle to where he can't stand, can't get up. He feels blood running down his face and from a head wound. And he comes to and he's groggy. and he smells what he said was the most horrific smell he'd ever smelled in his life. And unfortunately, that smell was burning flesh. He comes to and sees an NBA soldier with a flamethrower dousing his Mountain Yard team members, burning them alive, killing them. And so here's the lieutenant and Sergeant Howard, their bodies laying nearby, and this guy's going to take them out next. So I go through this in good detail, and Howard talks about it in some of his interviews that you mentioned, trying to get his fingers to work to pull a grenade off his chest and get that pin pulled. And here comes this NBA soldier with the flamethrower. And these guys end up looking each other in the eye, staring at each other. And he's got that Clint Eastwood like grimace looking at this guy, thinking, I'm beat up, I'm blown up, I'm burned up, I'm hurt, but you're not going to take me out. I've got this grenade. I'm going to take you out, and I can kill you, and you know it. And he talked about just that look and just staring at each other and the moment of death for one of these two. In the end, Howard ends up tossing the grenade toward the guy. The guy flees. It doesn't kill him. And then we're talking just the beginning of this mission. He's badly wounded. And so now he's got to crawl over there and try to grab the lieutenant, pull him back down the hill, get some of his other two Green Berets that are surviving to come give him fire support, help him get this body out of there. Bullets are flying, grenades are going off. It's just a hellfire going on through the jungle there. So much to the point that a lot of the indigenous troops have panicked and fled downhill and taken cover. So not only is he badly wounded, he's trying to save his lieutenant. Now he's enraged. He doesn't have a gun. He's beat up, and half his troopers have fled. And so as he gets down to one of the other sergeants, they're trying to get the lieutenant to safety. Bullets are still flying. Some of them hit the lieutenant's pack and set off his ammunition, blows both of them back again, knocks him almost senseless for the second time. So he's been hit multiple times, but yet he continues to drag and pull the lieutenant down the hill. Howard's unable to walk, unable to stand, and yet he's out there in the midst of all this, screaming for a gun, trying to get this guy to safety. The lieutenant's continuing to get hit by bullets in the meantime, so he's not in good shape. But this is the start of what will go on for hours, even beyond daylight, into darkness, trying to get the lieutenant to safety. As we continue the mission, it's a long period of time, as you can imagine, badly wounded men trying to pull a bravely wounded lieutenant down the hill to safety, to try to establish a perimeter, to try to set up a landing zone where they can call in choppers to get the rest of them medevaced out. It's a fight for survival at this point. But Howard shows great courage in rallying the troops, getting the other guys to fight. He demands and receives a gun from one of the other Green Berets. He fights back and shoots numerous NBA troops that are racing toward him, some so close that one of them actually just falls right across the lieutenant's body as Howard shoots him dead. And just getting the choppers in is going to take a long time to get out. Darkness falls. And so you have this period of calling in airborne support to bring in rockets, to bring in machine guns, to bring in bombs. And during the course of this long period, Howard sets up strobe lights near his body as they've moved the lieutenant to an extraction point. He's got his other men trying to keep him alive. He's calling in bomb strikes, some so close that he's saying, literally, just drop it on me, drop for the strobes, to where pieces of shrapnel are hitting him because the bomb's hitting so close. But they're able to keep the NVA at bay enough to keep these guys alive. But he's fighting to keep various men alive and himself. But he refuses medical treatment throughout this ordeal and continues talking to his cubby rider in the small plane and the other airborne support that's working over the area, to the point where they can be extracted. And when they finally do get extracted, it's close to 10 o'clock at night. It's hours after darkness. It's just about a matter of these guys being written off. And the first chopper comes in, he gets some of his dead and wounded yards on there and the lieutenant's body, excuse me. And as they're trying to get on the second chopper, Howard gets his other Green Berets on because he's now a mission leader. The lieutenant, Churston, he has expired by this time. He's passed away from his wounds, but you still get the body out. You take the body out. And before they lift off, Howard starts screaming, "No." And one of the other Green Berets is looking to see what he's seen. He noticed that they've tossed the lieutenant's body out of the other chopper before they lift off because of the weight, the number of men in there. So what does Howard do? He goes back on the ground, himself severely wounded, and he and the other Green Berets continue fighting until they can get the lieutenant's body back on their chopper and get extracted. So not only did he save lives of his team and take multiple wounds during the course of this mission, but he almost gave up his life a second time, jumping back off the chopper to go get the body of a fellow Green Beret. The numerous acts throughout that day and the hours that fighting took place. This time, when they submitted him, the paperwork eventually was processed for the Medal of Honor.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. We're discussing a man who qualifies as both, and that is Colonel Robert Howard. A biography, Beyond the Call of Duty, written by our guest and friend of the podcast, Stephen Moore. I love the story of Colonel Howard receiving the notification that he had been awarded the Medal of Honor. He talks about it. You talk about it, you and Colonel Howard's daughter in the interviews. You do a terrific job of detailing it in the book. After everything that you've just described, he's still in combat. And then one day, in the middle of combat, he receives notice that there's someone on the phone for him. Mr. Moore, take it from there.
Yeah, he's in the middle of a firefight. Some sappers or infiltrators are attacking the base, RPG, and a lot of firefighting going on. And he's getting this call to come back to the commo center to take a call. And you can imagine the words he used at that time. Who needs to talk to me? It's General Westmoreland. And in fact, you mentioned one of those interviews. There's a really good one where Bob talks about that. And he finally goes in there, takes the calls like, "General, what can I do for you?" And he said, "Bob, got some good news for you, but how are things going there?" He said, "General, pretty damn bad. I've been shot in the foot, and my foot hurts. I got a battle going on. My troops need me out there." But Westmoreland says, "Bob, good news. We're going to bring you back home and give you the Medal of Honor." And his first thought is, "I don't know how I'm getting out of here. We're in the middle of the fight. I can't just leave." General says, "Don't worry about that. We'll take care of that." And there's a long story of getting him out of there. But it's just humorous. He's sitting there bleeding, wounded, talking to the general. He's being told, "You're getting the Medal of Honor right after you've been wounded yet again."
That seems so fitting.
Absolutely. I think his life is movie worthy at some point. There's so many stories, so much valor of running to a chopper that's coming in to medevac your men, and it gets shot down. And now you got to go in there and pull these pilots out of the burning wreckage and shoot down enemy troopers that are racing toward that down chopper. And days on the ground with shrapnel in your rear and your back and your neck and just patching it up and keeping on going. He seemed almost indestructible.
The Medal of Honor is, I'm going to say always, although I'm sure there are exceptions, awarded as part of a White House ceremony. This takes place, is it in 71?
1971.
That Colonel Howard receives the Medal of Honor from the Leaders and Legends podcast's favorite president, and that's Richard Nixon. I've watched, I've obviously never been to see one in person, thank God, but watched footage, older and new. What takes place at these sort of ceremonies? And as you mentioned a few minutes before, I can't imagine another place or another instance of where Colonel Howard would feel more out of place.
Wasn't something he particularly enjoyed, being honored or called out like that, but he had certain demands. And there's a lot of stories in there of the day leading up to it, a couple of days there in Washington. And they told him, "Here's what you're going to wear. You're going to wear this kind of official uniform." And he fought his battle, said, no, sir, I'm going to wear my airborne trooper boots. I'm going to wear my airborne blouse and what I choose to do because I was airborne. I was Green Beret. That's the kind of uniform I'm going to wear at the White House. And he had enough respect that he got what he wanted. He had a staffer, a PR guy taking him around, telling him what his family could do and what they couldn't do. And he told a few people in so many words, I've earned this honor. I'll do what I choose. My family will have a nice meal. We'll be taken care of well. But by the time he gets to the White House with his wife, his great aunt, his daughters, it's awkward. He's awkward. He said he was just pale in the face. He was almost just so nervous. His heart almost quit beating. It just wasn't something that made him comfortable standing there with generals and all kind of prestigious people and several other men also being decorated that day. And he's one of the top. It wasn't something that made him, it made him awkward, obviously, but he got through it. He got the medal draped around his neck, and Nixon whispered in his ear, Bob, we're proud of you for what you've done for your country. And he said he could barely breathe at that point. He was so nervous.
I guess the number one fear is always in every poll for decades is speaking in front of folks or being in that sort of situation. The one interview I watched with Colonel Howard, he talks about how Nixon checks on him. Are you okay? Because he could tell he was pale. But he said that when President Nixon was pinning, I don't know if that's the right word since it goes around the neck, but that's the one we'll use, pinning the Medal of Honor. He says that Colonel Howard said that Richard Nixon's cheek touched his. And he thought that was unexpected, but a solemn moment. Is that true?
Yeah, he felt like it was just him affirming, we've got you, you've got this, we know what you did. And Nixon could probably tell that this captain was pretty nervous, but it was just a nod of assurance. And he said he had that look, he caught eyes with Nixon, and it stuck with him that this guy was just confirming, I know what you did, and I know you were special. And he respected that. It was a big day for him and his family.
Colonel Howard receives the Medal of Honor at the White House. We're going to just do the basics. It's 1971. The thing that I have encountered, and I absolutely believe you have too, people who receive the Medal of Honor are determined to go back to combat. And it's happened multiple times where Medal of Honor Medal of Honor recipients were killed later on. John Basilone, famously in the Pacific, Medal of Honor recipient. What did Colonel Howard do after the White House? What was the next few years like for him? And I want to be the person who said, Bob, you've gone above and beyond. You don't need to do anymore.
Yeah, ironically, as we mentioned earlier, it was more than 2 years passed from that mission in December of 1968 before he's called to the White House. So he returned back and continued to serve in Vietnam for 2 more years. And as recon company commander and training men and teaching them how to fight. And he would try to get back in a chopper to go in for a bright light mission or to pull some across the fence mission. And every time the colonel in charge would have to pull him back and say, get your rear end out of that chopper. You're not going over there, Bob, because they were forbidden by that point to return to active covert missions when a Medal of Honor was pending, which usually took a long time. But it was not for lack of trying that Howard didn't try to get back into action and try to fight. And as we mentioned, he did get wounded again before he received the medal. But post-war, he stayed in the service for more than 3 decades with the Army. So he was involved with Green Beret training. He commanded special forces groups. I mentioned one of his commands over in Korea, South Korea, served in Germany, served in a number of places. And as mentioned, he rose to the rank of colonel. And you touched on Medal of Honor recipients always wanting to remain in combat. Once he aged out and retired and couldn't be in combat, he found his way to stay involved by being involved with the Congressional Medal of Honor Society as an officer. And he and people like Gary Luttrell would go back overseas annually to wherever our troops were in action, be it Afghanistan or Iraq. And they would go to the combat zones. And for him, it was a chance to put the uniform back on, course, he's wearing the pale blue ribbon and his Medal of Honor. And these guys would sign pictures and talk to the troops and give motivational speeches. So he remained actively involved even when he was past the age of being able to fight. He never lost that desire to honor the troops and let them know, I know what you're doing. I know what you're here for, whether it's a war America supports or doesn't support largely. We haven't forgotten about you guys and women as time went on. There, of course, not just men as you had in the 60s in special forces, but everyone. He respected anyone that wore the cap, wore the Green Beret, or any advanced military service where they're doing things that they may not be recognized for at that particular time in their life because they just simply couldn't talk about it.
We have just a few more minutes with author and historian Stephen L. Moore. We're discussing his book, Beyond the Call of Duty, The Life of Colonel Robert Howard, America's Most Decorated Green Beret. Now, it's very interesting. Some of the most unnecessary, that's an editorial term, arguments, debates are about who has the most medals, who's the most decorated. It's become more of a recent phenomenon than like during World War II. Would you like to weigh in on that a little bit? You make the claim that he's America's most decorated Green Beret. I remember Colonel Hackworth, who was a phenomenal soldier. I don't know how many distinguished crosses he had, but several. So was there any caution, David Hackworth, who I'm talking about, was there any caution on your part in making the subtitle of your book, America's Most Decorated Green Beret?
Yeah, I would say so. You read various sources and they'll say that America's most decorated veteran or Marine or Navy SEAL or Green Beret. I didn't find much opposition to being the most decorated Green Beret, particularly from the Vietnam War. Now, that said, I've seen sites where they have a ranking, if you will, a point system of Silver Star, Bronze Star, or whether it's Navy Cross or Distinguished Service Cross, Medal of Honor, Air Medals, Purple Hearts, and they rank and rate how many points each is worth. And you've got Sergeant York and Audie Murphy and people from different wars, how they hit that point scale system. Howard may not hit the top on all those, but with 50 medals, 30 of which were earned in Vietnam service, I think he's certainly at the top for the most decorated Green Beret, Special Forces soldier there. Now, someone else may argue there's somebody else has more points than that, but that's my assertion from what I could tell and from his comrades.
Could you imagine a more infuriating conversation than how many points is each medal worth? A more infuriating conversation to be judged by Colonel Howard. He must have looked at someone and gone, you can't be serious. Like, you can't be serious.
No, one of the favorite stories I had was he had a personal keepsake from Audie Murphy, a medal that was on his desk when he was a command colonel. And people would talk about him and he'd say, no, this guy, Audie Murphy, that guy right there, he's a hero. I'm just the guy that did my job. He didn't want the praise, but he did recognize others that had done significant things before and after him. But that's not what he lived for, was to say, I got more than you or I got more points. People can debate as historians or military groups who's the top these days, but I don't know that it matters that much. It's just the number of times he was submitted and just the stories of what he did in combat. He deserves recognition, and I'm happy for the sake of his family to have helped bring some of that to him.
It was a little more than 25 years ago here in Indianapolis that we had a huge commemoration where we dedicated the Medal of Honor displays here right by the canal in downtown Indianapolis. Do you know if Colonel Moore attended those ceremonies? And have you ever seen it, quite frankly?
Colonel Howard? No, I have not seen that particular one. I know there's a number of Medal of Honor museums and special commemoratives around the country. Here in the Dallas area where I live, they're supposed to open in March, I believe, a National Medal of Honor Museum over close to the Rangers and Cowboy stadiums. So that will be interesting to go through and see what they have of Colonel Howard and countless other folks that earned that distinction. but I've not been to the one you're speaking of now.
If you could ask Colonel Howard if he just magically appeared because you've rubbed a lamp, what would you ask him?
I would go back and just get into his early 6 months there and what it was like on those first missions and why you were so compelled to keep going out, wounded time and again, and nothing stops you from going back, knowing you got two little girls back home and everything else. What is it that drives you? I infer, what that is and his sense of honor and country and duty, but love to just get into the mindset of that man and ask him questions, because he would create intricate booby traps to leave for the NBA. He had to run alongside a truck and toss in explosives and blow up soldiers and race back into the jungle before they could kill him. And just the crazy stuff he would do. Like, what motivated you to be that absolute fearless type of person?
And that's a great point, because it's not like he received a medal or a reward, every time he went out. There are hundreds and hundreds of instances where he did something that was completely and totally brave. And that was like, this is just me doing my job. There are some things that are above and beyond, which is the point of a medal, the Army Cross, the Distinguished Service Cross. But there's so many other things where I'm sure he just was like, yeah, I did that today. Just like he was talking about cutting his grass or raking the leaves. Yeah,
I ran over there and I blew up these guys in the back of the truck, took off before they could catch me, and didn't get any kind of medal for that. But stuff like that. And certainly there's teams that were wiped out and probably men that deserved high awards or medals of honor that no one survived to talk about the mission. Someone had to live, generally speaking, to come back and tell the details of something for a man to be awarded a high honor like that. And there's plenty that we don't know what happened to him those last few days.
If he could somehow, Colonel Howard could somehow magically appear on the Leaders and Legends podcast, my first question to him would be, how could you and how do you sleep?
Yes, and I ask my uncle a lot those kind of questions. Can you imagine one sleeping in the jungle with bugs and snakes and everything around you? It's wet, it's humid, you're sweaty, you don't have much food, and there's footsteps in the dark going through the bushes and the brush all around you as they're looking for you while you're supposed to sleep at night. How could you possibly sleep when guys are walking around trying to kill you while you're trying to rest?
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. Like all our podcast interviews, we dedicate this show, to the humanity, the legacy, and the generosity of P.E. McAllister, who landed in North Africa in November of 1942. Our guest today, Stephen L. Moore, author of Beyond the Call of Duty, The Life of Colonel Robert Howard, America's Most Decorated Green Beret. Please pick up this book. Please look for interviews on YouTube or wherever you can with Stephen Moore, with Colonel Howard's daughter, and watch the ones with Colonel Howard himself, where he is so nonchalant, not false humility, but just so nonchalant about what he's describing. You'd almost think you were watching a cooking show. It's incredible. Stephen, it's always a joy to have you on the podcast. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Robert. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.